I was in New York. I had started CUNY, which I'd never intended to go to, dropped out right away before I was 18. Started at 17, dropped out before I was 18. And then lived in, was involved with Anarchos, an anarchist group in New York for quite a while. And then started a kind of a feminist daycare center when I was 19 in the East Village. Again, influenced by the women's movement and by ideas about, non-hierarchical education and non-sexist child rearing. And, so we had welfare moms, hippie moms, and people, they had consciousness raising at night. And it was fantastic, but all the time I was also it was only a part-time job, and it was great, in terms of politics and community. But I was trying to make art. And it seemed, in a way, for me at that point, the struggle was, and there was Artists Meeting for Social Change, which, again, I felt like I wasn't enough of an artist somehow to actually claim that. But in a way, there was this, I was trying to connect sort of politics and art in all of those ways. In these anarchist groups, we did, a lot of kinds of art stuff. And in terms of feminism, so CalArts had a feminist art program. So I was interested in that. So I knew I wanted to come back to school, mostly because I wanted to have time to work and to do, to really think about what it was I was making and doing. And we were already, I was already somewhat involved. We'd already been in a dance in New York, a kind of a Judson dance with a choreographer who was part of Judson for a year, a dance that was kind of a rules-based dance, again, dealing with non-hierarchical structures. And, so again, these ways of kind of putting anarchism and avant-garde work together. But in terms of doing my own work and feeling like I had a community, I thought, I need to go back to school. But at the same time, I didn't want to start at the beginning, because also I'd been doing things like going to the alternate university in New York. So I took classes with Stanley Aronowitz and Murray Bookchin. I took Hegel, and, so I was pretty so I was pretty educated. So I applied to CalArts and I applied to NASGAT in Nova Scotia. The two schools that seemed to me the most, weren't going to make you start out painting and, conceptual and political. And also because they both gave you what was called life credit. They were untraditional. So and I thought I started, did all this stuff, and they both accepted me. And then I wanted Ernie to come with me, and he said, I don't want to go to Nova Scotia, it's too cold. So CalArts was the obvious choice. So I came. And in that way, CalArts was great. It was really experimental. It gave me a lot of credits for the things I'd done. They were really open in terms of how you wanted to position yourself. But for me, again, a working class New Yorker, coming to CalArts was shocking. I remember we'd gone to San Francisco first, where Ernie's family was at that point, his mother and sisters. And I think we bought an old car there and drove down here, which the car, of course, broke down on the way. And then as we drove up, on 5, or as I saw it, I just said, I was completely freaked. I just said, keep on going, keep on going, keep on going, and we drove past it. I just couldn't face it. So then he said, well, what do you want to do now? So we had to turn around and come back. But I was totally freaked out by it. And we drove up, it was evening, and I really have an incredible memory of it. There's nothing around, too. It's complete, devastation of landscape. And I got in, and the only other person I saw, which I thought was insane, was Diane Buckler on roller skates. And she looked like she was about 12. So I said, and of course I felt like I'd done, now I look back, I was, in my early 20s, but I thought, but I wasn't 18. And I thought, oh my God, here is a girl on roller skates in the middle of this completely deracinated, environment. What have I done to myself? So it was a bit like that. And then in terms of class, it was very interesting because I had never met rich people like this before. So you had, you know, the daughter of the king of whatever, you know, Siam, you know, you had, you know, and these cars in the parking lot. So there was this, so again, for me, issues of politics and class on the one hand, and then, you know, avant-garde and openness on the other, there was a kind of, you know, there were a lot of contradictions. And I think I was a bit of a purist, you know, I mean, I think that I was, you know, young and intolerant in a lot of things that I don't think I would be now. But, you know, so a lot of that seemed really odd, put it that way, and disconcerting. You know, I mean, look, in New York, you know, I lived in the East Village. I had a, you know, tub in the kitchen. Here I come, there's a swimming pool, and kids are swimming naked, and it's all, you know, la la land. So some of it seemed very unreal. On the other hand, it was very, in another way, it was very comfortable, because intellectually, it was a lot like New York, in a funny way. I mean, CalArts was. My first semester, I think I took a class with David Anton, who was already teaching at San Diego.
Oh, he taught a class.
But he came up, and so he taught classes, and he was talking about, you know, mostly about the art that was happening at the moment. And having just come from that, you know, it was a really interesting dialogue. So in those ways, there were always visitors, too. You know, so the year I was here, I think Linda Benglis was here, and Yvonne Reyna, who I also took a class with. And again, since I'd been looking at that, I'd actually seen a lot of her work in New York. I'd seen a performance story of a woman who, and then, you know, the film, and I was and Judson, I was very interested in, you know, the stance of Judson, you know, no more big statements, no music, no manipulation, you know, so in that way also, I would say that she was quite influential in terms of my thinking already. So to be able to take a class with her actually was fabulous. And another thing I would say about CalArts, actually, that was very interesting to me then, and I'm not sure it functions as much now, I just don't know, is, again, that interdisciplinarity. In New York, in the, you know, early 70s, and it's not the case now, you'd go to see, you know, let's say Grand Union dance at the Whitney, and you'd see poets and musicians and actors and artists and painters, you know, everybody. There was this sense of, you know, a world of ideas that were, you know, moving in those ways. Now when you go to an opening in New York, you see other artists, art students, collectors, museum people. When I go listen to new music, I don't see anybody that I see at art venues. There isn't that kind of crossover or feeding. And there was in New York, and amazingly enough, there really was at CalArts. And that also was something, actually, I think that has very much influenced me, because it was really where I saw and heard a lot of music. And the music school was amazing. And, you know, there's always music, and I really started listening to Terry Riley and to, you know, the people that I still listen to. It was extremely important to me. I came with sort of, I was trying to do, again, I was experimenting in all these different ways of putting together, you know, politics, feminism, art, you know. So I had been doing these kinds of sort of sculptures with hair and things, you know, hair and box, you know. But funnily enough, they didn't give me one of the they didn't give me Mimi as my advisor. They decided I was in sculpture, so they gave me Stefan von Huhn. And that was not a match. You know, he was a guy making big things, and I was like, you know, so that kind of didn't work. So in a funny way, I didn't really have people to work with in a funny way. And again, you know, some of that's me too. I came as an anarchist. I was not going to sit at any guy's feet. An anarchist feminist. So, you know, I mean, though Baldessari was very interesting and I liked his work, there were too many guys particularly sitting at his feet for me. You know, and again, this is just my perception as a you know, somewhat you know, pretty, not, and some of it actually was probably not true in a way, my idea of some of what was happening. It wasn't that I was necessarily right how I perceived things. Though in many ways he probably would have been the natural person for me to work with. I thought, and the feminist art program, which I was also very interested in, by the time I came, it had already kind of imploded. Judy had gone, Chicago, and Mimi Shapiro was left. Mimi and Paul Brock, I think, was the dean, I think. And I was not very, though I identified with Mimi in some ways, Jewish, New York, all of that. And she really identified with me. It was a little scary, so I felt, when he says I should say this. It was not a fit. And I can't help but say these things that really struck me. I can't help it, because the thing that struck me the most, and it's really maybe mean, but it was very telling for me at that moment, was, and maybe it's not fair. You can say it's not fair. But again, as somebody who's interested in both class and gender, I was, of course, and revolution at that moment. I came from anarcho, so I was in an anarchist group. She drove up in a Mercedes with the first, what do they call those kind of vanity plates? I think they call them, right? Vanity license plates. I'd never seen that anyway, living in New York City, and I didn't even drive at that point. She drove up with a vanity plate that said Ms. Art. And that, for me, kind of invalidated what she might say, which you can say is not fair. But, the Mercedes and this idea of, so for me, that, right away, bourgeois feminism, not interested. So, I think I was somewhat antagonistic. I can even go that far. Even though I also thought that she was kind of amazing, that she fought for all these things, and that it was really important seeing an active woman, again, among all these guys, particularly, again, in art school, to be taught by a woman, and again, it's interesting, I took classes with Yvonne, but what that represented for me at that point was not what I was really looking for. So in many ways, I kind of, I both was very stimulated, but didn't have that with the faculty, that sense of connection in many ways, except with the visitors. I took a class with Yvonne, and then Vito Conchi was there the next year. So in a funny way, I actually gravitated towards the outsiders, and in many ways, set myself up as an outsider as well. And for all these things that I can understand now, but didn't quite understand that. And living in Newhall, finding a Chinese restaurant, the whole thing was unreal. And Ernie trying to find a job, he worked at some point worked at Starwood, in like on Sunset, some nightclub where he was supposed to which had a 2-drink minimum. He's supposed to be insisting on people drinking in an era when people only took drugs. So of course he got fired from that, because how can you force somebody to drink when they're stoned completely? And of course, everybody at CalArts was also stoned completely. So that was kind of, but there was some nice things. And then, people lived in Peru. There was this kind of nice, and I did love Angeles National Forest. And I learned about fossils and went fossil tapping things on. It was completely like that. But then eventually, but the living thing was a problem. And then eventually we moved in. We stayed actually with Margaret Nielsen and George Herms. Margaret also was and she'd be fun to interview too. Margaret went to school with me. She's somebody who went to Chenard, didn't finish. She was a little bit older than me, and she was coming back also. And she was married to George Herms at that time. And they had a very, very giant loft on Figueroa, which was real, which was down and out, winos peeing outside, just completely. But I kind of liked that. There was that side of LA that was familiar. Hey, home, so I kind of liked that. But in a way, we were pretty nomadic, because I didn't understand Los Angeles, I think. It took me a very long time to love it, actually, and understand it. And then Los Angeles changed so much. So in that way, there was CalArts, which in a way is it was a new building. So it's completely blank in that way, you know, looks like a hospital. And in many ways, LA felt that way too, because there were so few cultural institutions. County Museum, yeah, because I think Norton Simon was,
yeah, the
maybe there was
Pasadena
Norton
Museum
down.
closed in 1973.
Yeah, it closed in 73. There was only the county. There was nothing else. I mean, there was the, you know, the Getty, the old Getty.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, you know, who's going to go there? So that was really it. So in that way, coming from New York with a really lively galleries, I mean, there were a few, there was LA Louvre, there were a few galleries, for sure. But again, those galleries really only showed men. And then there were things like, you know, Woman House, which was really exciting. I mean, you know, but that was kind of falling apart. I mean, so it was a funny moment where the kinds of alternative things that were happening in New York and in San Francisco, because I did go up to San Francisco in the middle of my being here for that reason, you know, because we did start with other people here, a situationist group in Echo Park when I was at CalArts. But then they all moved up to San Francisco, and Ernie moved to San Francisco too. And I was left. So in that way, and we started working on Jump Cut, becoming editors of Jump Cut, which was also in the Bay Area, and working on Left Curve, which was again a left artist publication, mostly from people who had graduated from the Art Institute of San Francisco. So there were so many kinds of, you know, and in San Francisco, of course, there were all these alternative galleries at that point. So there were this sense of those kinds of changes happening in these other places. But LA was quite slow for that, and you know, for all, you know, and you could find all kinds of reasons why. In many ways, CalArts, I think, was and continues to be a major catalyst in that change. The things that happened in LA, so many of those people came out of CalArts, you know, who started to stay and started to, you know, make alternative, you know, galleries, spaces, you know, freeways. I mean, the kinds of things that started to happen here. But there was this lag, and it really didn't, you know, barely began around 76. So there was this kind of, you know, time before that. And of course, in the same way, except for the first few people like, you know, like Baldessari, most of the people coming to teach here were kind of imported. Certainly, Mimi and Paul were not comfortable being in California and wound up going back to New York. So there was some of this sense actually here. Though again, the music people, that's why they had such an impact. And you know, seeing people doing Tai Chi. I mean, this really feeling this other possibility that wasn't so much really represented in the art school actually at that point. So I think that was difficult. And I think, and again, because of my expectation, which was completely idealistic about this feminist art thing, I mean, you know, I also think that I was probably angrier than I would have been because I had this idea. And a lot of people came with that same idea. And most of those people I'm still friends with today, women. I mean, I actually do have a number, my friend Jill Cement, I don't know if you've spoken to her, but
we haven't.
She's fantastic, and you know, she became a novelist, and she was Yvonne's TA in the class that I was, and she had done film, was doing film as well in the art school, and so we're still friends, really good friends. So in that way, CalArts was a really bonding experience, you know. So some of the things that I wanted to do in terms of seeing myself as an artist and figuring out the kind of political work I wanted to do, I actually was able to do here. Though some of it kind of against what, you know, in my second year here, there was definitely, I mean, after the first year, in Yvonne's class, we did, out of that class, we did a night of performances. And Ernie and I did a performance about, I think it was called An American Romance, but it was kind of about why we weren't in the Weather Underground. Because right then, there were all these stories in the newspaper about things being blown up. And we took that seriously. I mean, we meant that seriously. You know, you know, I mean, that was very much about what was happening in terms of where you stood. And, you know, we did a performance with video, you know, slides, photos, live actors, lots of things about that. And after that, Mimi Shapiro stood up and said, the art world is a family. You have now put yourself beyond the pale of that family. You're not one of us anymore. You're not part of the art world. And, I mean, nobody said anything. People were shocked. And a lot of people, it's not like people didn't respond and people didn't say, oh, that was great. But that really kind of felt to me, kind of CalArts position, or, you know, felt to me like that. So basically, after that, we all decided that I might be better off going up to San Francisco, finishing, you know, the film that I was working on. I was working on a long film, and then come down for another, you know, couple of months. So in that, so I mean, maybe that gives you a sense of that there was a lot of friction. But in another way, CalArts asked for, and you could express a lot. There was a lot of contradictions going on, but they were expressed, which is interesting. You don't find that in institutions. So in that way, there was expression of all of this fit, non-fit. What is this institution? Why isn't it as you know, as open and as experimental as I want it to be? You know, all of these, you know, funny, you know, and strange classes, you know, where you experimented, you know. So in a way, it was quite interesting, and you know, I have to say, certain classes like David Anson's class in terms of history of avant-garde and stuff was fantastic. So there were these, you know, there was a lot of input in terms of people coming and moving through, you know, in those ways. But it also was, in another way, not what it's advertised itself to be. And maybe it couldn't be. Maybe, again, that was a utopian idea that could not actually be fulfilled. But it allowed for a lot of experimentation and a lot of kinds of, you know, acting out also. And let's face it, you know, these are all people, you know, young, pretty much younger than 25, and there was a lot of acting out, you know, in terms of the, you know, faculty and students. There was an enormous nervousness around money and funds and, you know, and of course, but in another way, we didn't realize how amazing it was at this institute, that this was happening. And, you know, so there was this funny kind of, you know, but there definitely was a lot of tension around money and around making sure that the funding continued. And people were aware of, again, the contradictions of being funded by Disney and then trying to do this very opposite thing. So, you know, that was interesting, but it was very, you felt it was very precarious. And everybody said from the beginning, I mean, the building was built so that it could be, you know, a hospital if CalArts failed. So that was right out there. So it was not, you know, it was definitely, this was not a going concern. This was not an institution yet. This was still finding its, you know, identity and, you know, stability, and was this going to happen? Wasn't it going to happen? But of course, but in another way, it obviously felt, I mean, I know people who went, like Vanillin went, I think, when it was still at Burbank, before it moved, when it was kind of at temporary quarters. So it obviously felt much more, once you got into this, you know, big building with giant doors, it did have a feeling of permanence, but you still weren't sure what it was going to permanently be, you know. But I think that it still moved. I think people felt much more of that was much more of an institution, and probably acted out much more as well against it than they did in Burbank when they were all in it together and they weren't even sure that it was an institution yet. This actually, you weren't, you know, you had no place to live and it was alienating, and you went to, you know, you had Sylmar, and you were sitting on the, you know, you went to cowboy bars, and, you know, so there was this kind of very strange kind of sense. And then people did, you felt also, not just economically, but again, culturally, like you could say Paul and Mimi, not John Baldessari, because he was from here, but you did feel very much that people had one foot in and one foot out. And also, again, historically, it was very much a time of incredible flux. So you did have the Weather Underground putting bombs in, you know, in places, and you know, had just had Patty Hearst. I mean, there was this sense of change. I mean, but CalArts did feel mostly part of the change. But then when you saw Mercedes and Vanity Plates, it didn't feel so much like, it felt like part of the bourgeoisie. So there was this kind of movement back around that. That was very interesting. So things were like that, and there was, you know, and it was so amazing in other ways too, because when I came back from San Francisco, there was a couple of months that I didn't have a place to live, you know, and I was working, and it seems to me that I put in an air mattress in one of the rooms. Was it like on the second floor, like where the gallery is now?
Second floor gallery, yeah.
Yeah,
I
where
visited at
where
one
the art
point.
gallery. Yeah, and Ernie visited me, and I lived there.
Up there, yeah.
Yeah. So in that way, I know all the things you're not supposed to do, but that to me, again, because I had no money, there was a kind of amazing sense of accommodation, you know, or just kind of do your thing in a way that was really, actually helpful.